Hello, and welcome to today's Institute of Public Administration of Canada, National Capital Region, panel discussion, Elevating Canadian Public Policy Making through Anti-Racism Frameworks. C'est un plaisir de vous accueillir au nom de l'Institut d'administration publique du Canada, région de la capitale nationale, à cet événement d'apprentissage, améliorer l'élaboration des politiques publiques canadiennes au moyen d'un cadre de lutte contre le racisme. Cet événement se déroulera en anglais, mais vous êtes invités à poser des questions dans la langue de votre choix. Today's presentation will be in English, but you are encouraged to ask questions in the language of your choice. Thank you. And over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Sharda. Good afternoon, everyone. We are bringing together three dynamic individuals to lead a discussion to inspire us on the role that each of us can play to create a more equitable and inclusive Canada through an anti-racist policy analysis. Our hope at IPAC-NCR is that after leaving today's session, you will have gained many insights on how to reimagine the policy development cycle so that public policy better addresses long-standing inequities, dismantles historically exclusionary power structures, and fosters anti-racist and anti-oppressionist solutions. There will be a questions and answers period at the end of our panel discussion, and our co-facilitator, Farah Ahmad, will be monitoring the chat. So we encourage you to put your questions in the chat function so that we can ask them later. Farah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I will now like to introduce Ursula. She will be introducing our panel. Ursula serves as the chair of IPAC-NCR and throughout her term has led a team that recognizes the importance of supporting and promoting excellence in public administration. So I will pass it on to Ursula.
Thank you, Farah. Alors, bonjour à tous et toutes. Yes, I'm Ursula Goebel, and I'm honored to be chair of IPAC-NCR and the board. I'm joining you from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. And while we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. And from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations, Inuit et Métis peoples who call this land home. Alors, au nom de l'IAPC-RCN, je souhaite la bienvenue à tous et toutes présentes aujourd'hui, en particulier aux membres de l'IAPC-RCN. En tant que plus grand groupe régional de l'IAPC au Canada, nous nous engageons à vous offrir une gamme unique d'opportunités d'apprentissage et de développement, ainsi que les liens au sein d'une communauté de professionnels qui partagent une passion et un engagement vers l'excellence dans l'éducation publique. We are very, very proud to host today's special event on the topic of elevating Canadian policy through an anti-racism framework that will absolutely highlight new perspectives on the dimension of addressing anti-racism and action to address anti-racism. IPAC-NCR has hosted previous events on this topic, and we are truly honored by all of our panelists and all of our audience who are joining us today to stay engaged on this topic. This event, as Chris noted, offers insights from thought leaders and government sector leaders on how to reimagine the policy development cycle so that public policy better responds to the needs to address inequity and dismantle historically exclusionary power structures and foster anti-racism, anti-oppression solutions. I would like to express my deepest appreciation to fellow IPAC board members, Chris Scipio, Sharda Terachandra, Farah Ahmed, Daniel Deliri, and Noah Pollock for organizing this important discussion, and especially to our esteemed panel of speakers for your participation today. Before passing it back to Chris to introduce our panelists, I would just like to share a few save the dates for upcoming IPAC-NCR activities that you may be interested in as well. In 2 weeks, on May 19th, we are organizing a special event with other IPAC regional groups on the topic of fearless advice, loyal implementation, the relationship between public servants and political officials. Le 22 juin, vous êtes invités à vous joindre à nous lors de notre Assemblée générale annuelle et à rencontrer d'autres membres de l'IAPC. Et vers l'automne, rejoignez-nous en personne, on espère, le mardi 13 septembre au soir au Mill Street Brew Pub, alors que nous réunissons les membres de l'IAPC dans un café du monde pour interagir avec les autres fonctionnaires invités. You are invited to learn all about our activities through our social media channels. And if you're not already an IPAC member and are interested in joining our mailing list, just visit us on our website at www.ipac.ca. All of our events, virtual, in-person, as well as our numerous communications tools, bulletins, and newsletters really offer exceptional opportunities to increase our understanding of key issues that are shaping public administration, while also enabling and fostering networking and relationship building across our sectors. And we look forward to staying in touch and to seeing you. Thank you so much. And back to you, Chris, to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Ursula. It is my honor, really is an honor to introduce this panel. First, I'll introduce Kim Nesbeth. Kim is a dynamic public policy professional with experience across policy networks and issues, ranging from economic well-being, inclusive policy engagement, anti-racism policy, and policy-focused governance systems. Kim's approach reflects an interdisciplinary understanding of policy issues facing communities and groups. It is based on her professional, academic, and lived experiences. As a Jamaican-Canadian woman of West African and Indian descent, she brings that to her work. Her work as a policy analyst, consultant, and founder of Elevate Policy is extremely important. And if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to read her paper on an anti-racism policy analysis framework, which we will be discussing today. Our second speaker is Dr. Yabom Gilpin-Jackson. She is the Vice President of People, Equity, and Inclusion at Simon Fraser University. She is a well-known leader in organizational development, people practices, equity, diversity, inclusion, and transformational change. In her previous roles as the Chief People Officer at the British Columbia Lotteries Corporation, as well as Executive Director for Organizational Development at Fraser Health and Regional Lead of Organizational Development at Vancouver Coastal Health, Dr. Gilpin-Jackson has shown leadership and an ability to inspire and to bring about change. I will now invite my co-host, Charlotte, to introduce our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Deputy Minister Daniel Kwan-Watson, who serves as Deputy Minister at Crown, Indigenous Relations, and Northern Affairs Canada. This is his 5th appointment as a Deputy Minister. Many of you will know Deputy Minister Kwan-Watson from the conversations that were sparked when he shared his personal experiences of racism throughout his life, including as a public service servant representing Canada on the world stage. He wrote an open letter in response to a column in the National Post in which the author questioned the degree to which racism and discrimination actually are a part of the Canadian reality. If you haven't had a chance to Google the letter or to visit the website, The Only Way is Forward, I would urge you to do so. Like many racialized public servants, I was deeply touched by the letter because in it, I saw recognition of my very own experience. I felt heard. And that is why representation matters. It is an honor to introduce you, Deputy Minister Kwan-Watson, as today's moderator. Thank you.
And here we are. So, and I guess we're at the stage here where we're about to engage in a number of questions, and wonderful to have Yabom and Kim here today. And thank you for joining and bringing all your expertise and wisdom. And thank you to the audience members for joining here, because these conversations are valuable only in as much as they continue to grow. only in as much as we plant the seeds of ideas and that they get shared across institutions and organizations, and that those ideas grow into action, and that they grow in places where previously we wouldn't necessarily have been seeing this change. And so I guess wanted to start with a couple of questions here. And I just wanted to make sure that I haven't made a big mistake and that I'm not supposed to be waiting for Kim and Yabom to do their presentations first. Is that correct? Okay, good. It is correct. I just wanted to make sure that the moderators didn't have to, the organizers didn't have to jump in and say, Daniel, you messed it up. So. Well, today's theme, I'm going to start with this question, is about elevating public policy. Now, if you talk to any Canadian public policy professionals, they're rightly proud. They talk about the great things that we have done. They talk about Canadians' reaction to the responses on things like CERB and things like COVID-19 and so many others. And they say, wow, we have an awful lot of success in public policy in this country. But you've both done a lot of work that shows that there are some gaps. And in fact, there's some important gaps and that we're not as strong as we can and should be. And there are some ways to deal with that. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit before we go any further about what does it mean to you when we say that we're trying to elevate Canadian public policy? And maybe, Yabom, I could start with you as, a former graduate of a university in British Columbia that wasn't Simon Fraser, but we don't need to mention that. I'll start with a fellow British Columbian. So go ahead, Yabom.
Yes, we won't mention the other university. Thank you for those warm introductions, and thank you, Deputy Minister, to you for that opening. This is a really important question, and it's very important to me. What elevate means to me, in particular, is this phenomenon. I'll describe it that in the arc of supporting systems transformation. I know we're going to talk about frameworks shortly, but in my practice and in my work I have shortened. There's a lot of models for facilitating systemic change and transformation, but I have really shortened it down to there's really 3 stages we need to be thinking about and planning around. That is initiating transformations, it's facilitating the journey, and it's sustaining transformations. What I notice continually, this is pre-2000, pre the pandemic and pre the racial justice, resurgence of racial justice movements, is a lot of folks at the policy level, at the institutional level, are coming in and they're initiating transformation. They're having the listening sessions, they're doing ad hoc training, which is really all about laying groundwork and setting the foundation. It is not facilitating a transformational journey for change, and it is certainly not addressing the sustaining structures that need change and transformation to be embedded. And so elevating this work, to me, means going the full journey. It means at the beginning that you are naming. I will often now challenge and or say no to embarking on certain journeys if the focus is only on initiating. I will raise very quickly, what does this journey look like for you? What are you anticipating? What are you planning towards? Have you thought already about the time, the resources, the effort, and yes, the actual actions that need to happen through the entire cycle of facilitating for transformations? And if people have show the will to go the journey, then I'm interested, because that's elevating the work. And if not, then at the minimum, people need to be aware that what they're doing is only consciousness raising, which in itself could cause more harm than good. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Kim, what does elevating mean to you?
Thank you, Deputy Minister Kwan Watson, for the question. Before I respond, I'd like to first just share a few quick things. So I'd like to say a big hello to everyone joining us today, and that I'm so glad that we have the chance to share this space together. And I hope that you find this to be a good experience. I'd like to quickly also thank the IPAC-NCR and the organizers of this event, particularly Farah, Christopher, and Sharda for their support and guidance as we brought this event together. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I recognize that this place known as Toronto is now the home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also want to acknowledge and thank Indigenous communities in Ontario, particularly Friendship Center communities, for sharing their knowledge with me and showing me a truly community-centered way of doing policy work. And I'd also finally like to acknowledge my African and Indian ancestors, my Jamaican ancestors, who have shown me the importance of voice, of doing policy work from a place of love, and the importance of unity. And I recognize that these traditions have built the foundations of my anti-racism work today. So to get back to your question, Deputy Minister, I think what I've mentioned, particularly around my ancestors and doing elevate policy work from a place of love and the importance of unity, it really sheds light on my perspective and my approach. And to start with, I chose the name Elevate Policy in my own work for the organization, the business that I created, because it is what I would like to do. As a person who is a policy professional and who's lived, partly in Jamaica and in Canada, I've noticed a lot of different things about, different societies and the different ways that governments, respond to the priorities of people, and how different histories affect the societies that we live in today. And coming to Canada as an immigrant, as a child, and I've definitely, benefited so much from the very rich traditions of Canadian public policy and all the peoples who live here, and definitely grateful for the incredibly nurturing environment that Canadian public policy has created for a lot of us, for all of us. But there are definitely things that I've noticed as a person who is racialized, being from Jamaica and partly African and Indian, definitely things that I've noticed as an individual and in my community, where I've seen the connections between public policy and outcomes, particularly differences between, different ethnic groups, differences, across, sectors and, focus areas like housing, education, employment, income security. And so I've come to understand that there are definitely gaps, even though we have this very rich and nurturing policy environment, that policy work doesn't always translate the same for everyone, as we know. So my perspective on the issue is that it's important to highlight the historical issues and the ways that those historical issues have influenced where we are today and how it's influencing outcomes. Really important to shine a light on that so that we can address those things in appropriate ways. And that's what I mean when I speak about my work in terms of elevating, right? So recognizing that we have a wonderful foundation, to build on, but there are definitely areas where we can improve. And it's not only in terms of, racial disparities, it's across a number of different areas, across society. We've observed, many of them. So it's recognizing where we are now, where we can go, because I think it is important to pursue our full potential. I think that's what, I think generally that's what people hope to do as a collective. And so I really see public policy as a way to help get us there. And that's a part of why, I really enjoy public policy work, like truly I do. And that's why I've definitely see the importance of bringing my own voice to the policy space, because I have these different, backgrounds and experiences, not always reflected in traditional policy spaces and Canadian policy spaces. So I'm bringing my perspectives to help identify those things that maybe sometimes we overlook, but are still very important and useful in getting us to be our best selves as a society.
Well, I just remind the participants that there'll be an opportunity for you to forward your questions through the chat, and we will get to that point. I'm going to ask a couple more questions here, but then we'll move into that. And rest assured, anytime you have the talent of Kim and Yabom in the room, you want to ask everything you can. And so do make sure that you get your questions into the chat, and we will do our best to answer many of those as we can. Now, I do want to move to some of the practical, like you've talked about why you want to do these things and why it's important, but how to do this is intimidating for a lot of people. And even for those who have some experience in it, when you're dealing with organizations that might be resistant, or if you're dealing with organizations that have goodwill but just don't realize how much work is required, the practicalities of the practitioner make a huge difference. And so I want to focus in on that. And I'm going to reverse the order so you get to go twice in a row, Kim, and then I'll come back to you, Yabom. But you wrote last December in Policy Options that a substantive gap, and you mentioned the gap a minute or two ago, exists in the policy literature and practice about what anti-racist policy analysis looks like. And I wonder if you could tell us from your experience, what is the practical in anti-racism in public policy that people would need to pay attention to, that you're not necessarily going to grasp if you just found all the literature to get your hands on and went through?
Thank you for that question. Very thought-provoking question, Deputy Minister Juan Watson. So yeah, I'll first just reiterate that point around there being a major gap in the policy literature around anti-racism policy, and particularly in the Canadian policy literature. And it's something I've experienced, as a policy analyst, as a policy professional, when I'm, especially in the last few years where I've been focusing more on anti-racism policy, just not having those, points of guidance in the literature that I can turn to, like I was able to access, when learning about public policy analysis, generally speaking, as a policy student. As my policy focus has evolved, I haven't been able to find the tools necessary to respond to, for example, topics that the clients that I'm working with in my consulting practice are interested in, or be able to respond to just what's happening in society, right? And especially this started to come up for me in 2020, definitely after the Black Lives Matter protests that summer, but also before that. So in February 2020, I started to write more specifically about anti-racist focused public policy. But there is definitely a gap. And when I look and try to do, literature searches today, I'm still not really able to find, articles that speak specifically about what anti-racism policy analysis looks like. In fact, the term really doesn't exist in any substantial way in terms of what I've been able to find and come across. So I started to notice this more and more, and I realized that it was affecting the way that I do my policy work, because when people are interested in hearing your policy advice around anti-racism and equity, driven analysis, it's important to speak in specific terms, right? And in consistent terms. And, definitely with the concept of institutional racism, it can be very abstract, and we don't always know how to start the conversation, what the specific points of focus should be, and ultimately, what are we trying to say? Like we know that it exists, but so what then after? And definitely we're aware of what happens in the community. We see evidence about the disparities but how can we connect what government is doing to those outcomes? And so I decided that it was really important to piece together an approach that would be practically useful for me in doing my policy work. And that's how the framework came into being. So just a representation of my experience, as an individual, observing public policy and as a policy practitioner. And so I have, developed a framework with 5 key points of 5 key consideration areas, so that it provides, again, that practical place for people to begin their analysis. And it really is one approach, keeping in mind that there are many different approaches to this type of analysis, but it allows us to put together a conversation and build up our conversations and, elevate our conversations so that we are more clear in terms of what we mean when we say anti-racist policy analysis. So 5 key considerations. They include prioritizing the elimination of racial discrimination, reconciliation and reparative action, community responsiveness, strategic policy coordination, and institutional accountability. So it's a way that we can understand exactly how we can advance our work as policy professionals, specifically on the topic of anti-racism analysis.
Yeah, bon. Thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you. I think I'll just add on to what Kim has already said, just from the perspective of, I think the core of the question, Deputy Minister, is moving from the literature and a theoretical lens to practice. And I think for me, that has been really my focus in my scholarship and practice work, is bridging theory and practice. And so fundamentally, I think what's needed that you won't find in the literature is we absolutely need frameworks, because our human minds need to organize the complexity of these issues in a way that allows us to move through them. What is missing for me often that moves us from theory to practice is the principles and the underlying process that's needed to take any framework, even the ones that call out some of these issues, and bring it alive. And so it is really moving beyond the performative, the theoretical, to the spirit of what's the intent here and the level of commitment, operating in this space of really having principles that guide the ethos of the work. Kim talked about coming from orienting from a place of love in entering this work. Many of our colleagues from the African-American tradition will talk about a liberatory and abolitionist-minded orientation to this work. And for me, it's all of that plus a community engaged way of doing this work. I think fundamentally, when we were preparing, Deputy Minister, you asked a really interesting question, to which I responded that fundamentally was a question about what's at the core for us of this elevating public policy in terms of anti-racism. And my response was what I will share now in terms of moving from theory to practice, which is that fundamentally we can continue to use any framework or any tool in this space as a colonial instrument when we don't put behind it the spirit and the intention of love and liberation for all. And so any tool, any framework, even the ones that, again, call out some of these issues, can be used with a colonial mindset. In my professional organization development field, there is a move away from diagnostic frameworks and diagnostic methodologies and not a complete move away. For example, we all know we need disaggregated race-based and equity-based data to see issues at a systemic level. But what has been increasingly recognized in terms of the practice of facilitating for change and transformation is that it's in the dialogic processes, it's in the community engagement, it's in the conversations with the authentic intention of co-creating policy that meets the needs of the community. That's where theory meets practice, and that's where change happens.
Great. Thank you both for those excellent answers. And I remind people, do feed in your questions if you would like to take advantage of this extraordinary opportunity. I'm going to give two scenarios. And Kim gets the advantage here because she gets to answer the second one. And Yabom, who recognizes a pattern now, is going to get to go a second time in a row. So I'll give Yabom the first scenario, and I'll give the second one immediately after Kim. In the first scenario, I'm a manager in my group, and my boss has come to me and said, listen, I know we need to do something about anti-racism. I'm not really sure what we need to do. I don't know this realm well enough, but I know that we have a problem. I know we need to do something. What advice do you give that person who's been tasked with that thing by their boss? And Kim, the question I have for you in this scenario is, I'm an analyst. I'm a fairly senior analyst in my group. And I heard this fantastic speech from Kim Nesbeth, who was feeling uncomfortable about the gaps that she saw in the world that she was living with. I see the same thing. But nobody seems to be interested in listening, and I'm not really sure how to go about having the conversation. What advice do each of you give to that person in the scenario that I described for you? And so, Yabom, you by the order in which we're going, you get to go next. So.
Thank you so much. And that is a very real scenario for me. I'm often called upon, whether within my role or in community or consulting and supporting others to answer that exact question. And I'll give two responses depending on the context. One is that again, we need frameworks to organize our minds around complexity. And often that question is being asked in a context where there is a complete absence of a framework, whether that's a guiding framework or an established one, in which to even start to put your arms around this situation. So if that's the scenario, what I would immediately advise, and this is just taking the scenario you offered at face value, is to do that initial current state assessment, to get their hands on whatever is the right framework, as Kim mentioned, in the context, to put their organization through, whether that's one of the maturity, and at that stage, it's not even frameworks to do the work. It might be even maturity models around where are we as far as this work institutionally, and get a sense of where the organization is at. And based on that baseline, begin to realize where there's opportunities. They can then take forward to their boss, presumably, and executive leadership to paint the picture, essentially paint the current state picture. Don't just come out with programs and say this will fix it. Get clear what the systemic view is and take that in to move things forward. The second way I would respond to that is I also actually often have this scenario where there's been a lot of analysis, there is a lot of data, and there actually just is an action that is following that data. So in that scenario, what I would advise is pulling together the themes of the already existing data that has been surfaced, and find a way of pointing out what actions have or have not already been taken, and bring that forward as a way of saying, while we might feel stuck, hey, there's a lot of great current state analysis and systemic view data that we do have, and that will indicate that this is where we might begin this journey. And really paint then in that scenario the picture of, to continue in inaction is basically to endorse the status quo. And for me, that has often been what has nudged people from inaction to move things forward and advance this work. Because oftentimes it's not for a lack of evidence, it's not for a lack of data, it's for a lack of will to take on the actions that are needed to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Kim.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Minister. And so I think the scenario you shared, it sounded like it was one about interest in the workplace, right? In terms of using this type of analysis or focusing on anti-racism and equity. So I think there are a few things that come to mind for me in that scenario, on a personal level and also in terms of the institutional environment. So firstly, on a personal level, as a policy analyst, I think it's important for us to, and I'll just say us as, putting myself in the community of policy professionals, important to think about the purpose of our work. So as a policy professional, my goal is to provide the best advice to, whichever government or organization or client I'm working with. And in our socioeconomic context and in our society today, institutional racism is something that it takes place. It is a part of our systems, is happening. It's affecting the policy outcomes. And so with that in mind, I'm always looking for ways to ways to create policy solutions that will actually help us to get to the end state and desired outcomes that we want to achieve. And we don't want to see disparities, for people based on their ethnic background. Like, I don't think that's something that's generally desirable. So as a policy analyst, I think it's really useful to think about how we can get to those desired outcomes and what kind of tools are available. So if we do find a tool that's available to help us to provide, richer analysis, more in-depth and complex analysis that gets to the nuances of things like institutional racism, I think that should be a major point of interest, because that will help us to be better policy professionals, will help us to do a better job, in my opinion, in terms of the work that we're asked to do. And especially if, if someone is a public servant and, working in the professional public service, I think it's really important, along with things like being nonpartisan and providing impartial advice, really important to be anti-racist in our orientation to our work, because again, that is a part of the society that we live in. Things like multiculturalism and inclusion have been, policy priorities for us in Canada for some time now. So I think that, focusing on anti-racism policy analysis can help us to get to those more desired outcomes. And I think that should be a major point of interest. And that should help, go from interest to action in terms of our workplaces. I think it's also really important to think about the communities that we're serving and the purpose of our work. So similar to what Dr. Gilpin-Jackson was sharing, is really key to think about who is going to benefit from this policy work that I'm doing. I think that should be a key framing, a point of framing for our work every day, like thinking about actual people in communities, people who are looking to governments for support for whatever reason, them to, just live with dignity and in a space of freedom. And so I think that's a big part of why focusing on anti-racism is so key. I'll just say also quickly, the institutional environment of public policy in Canada is really important because I feel like it doesn't always provide those incentives to seriously consider equity and anti-racism, as a central piece of focus. I've seen it often as sort of an additional, sort of on the side or appendix type of approach, but I really feel like our institutions should now pivot to focus on centering anti-racism and create those incentives to help advance that. So creating a culture of equity where members of public service organizations feel like they will be celebrated and recognized for their work in advancing equity and racial equity in particular. I feel like racial equity is something that often falls to the bottom of priority agendas. And so creating those institutional structures and incentives to encourage that focus and transformation, I think, is also a key thing. And of course, that won't always be front of mind for someone who's doing the work right now, but it's something that I think we should look to, in the future, the near future.
Well, you've both touched on something that resonates very much with me, and I'm sure resonates with a great number of the panelists as well. And you both in different ways talked about the personal reaction to people whose intent and approach might not actually match up with your own values in the same way that you would hope or expect to do. And I include myself very much in this group where I have been asked over time to do things where I've not actually been convinced that people really understand what they're getting themselves into. I don't think I've been in anything where people were asking in bad faith just to make things go away, but they had no idea what they were getting into, and I wasn't convinced at all that they were prepared to deal with what was going to be coming. And as a member of a particular community or set of communities, the last thing I was willing to do was promise the option of a real conversation that wasn't going to turn into a real conversation. So, feel free to say, no, Daniel, I'm not going to talk about something this personal and here, move on to the next question, please, if you want. But how do you balance that world in which that the expectations and the understanding of what must necessarily follow from the path that people think they're embarking on might not play out in a way that is going to make you happy? And I don't necessarily mean just by the outcome of it, but by the way it's going to work. And how do you address, and I think it's for a number of us, myself included, the last couple of years, that's even harder, because I think many of us sense that this is a moment in time that if we don't seize it, we can lose it for another 10 or 20 years or whatever it is. Or worse yet, people can become convinced that, see, we were right all along, there never was a problem. And I think, I'll speak for myself here, but I suspect for many other people, there is a different conflict over the last 2 years about how we respond to these requests, and a personal conflict about whether or not to engage, how to engage, on the worry that how do I go talk to other people that I know have been talking about this for decades, and worry that maybe all I'm going to do is get them that much more amped up, and then in the end, the carpet will be yanked out from under our collective feet. Now, maybe that's not what you feel, but I suspect from what you've said that you've had at least tinges of that. So I won't assign the question to anyone, because you can tell me next question, Daniel, if you want. But if you have any thoughts, I'd sure appreciate it. And I suspect the audience members would too.
I'm happy to lean in and speak, and Kim, I see you nodding, so I expect you. Likewise, Will. I'm going to speak very directly and personally to this question. And Deputy Minister, I want to thank you for the question. And I want to thank you for your example. And actually grateful that you were introduced from you're very modeling actually of the question that you're asking us in terms of the open letter that you wrote. And so I'm going to go to a conceptual response and then the personal within that for me. And the conceptual theoretical response is part of my my scholarship in human and organization development was around transformative learning and transformation, and the idea of how much narrative matters, including personal narrative, in shifting systems and creating transformation. So that is to say that for me, where I go, where I'm feeling those very real conflicts at the intersection of being in public service, of being deeply concerned about systemic social change and social justice in terms of anti-oppression and pro-belonging across the spectrum, but in particularly anti-Black racism as a Black woman, is that I lean into lived experience, and through that make clear the tensions, the conflicts, and the contradictions that I'm experiencing. So in a very real sense, for example, when George Floyd happened, I was very quiet for a while. I have a monthly blog. I write regularly for various journals, and I didn't say anything. And then I finally wrote, similarly to what you did, a very short blog called I Can't Breathe. And I have a fairly strong ownership of that blog, and that blog is by far the most read blog. Leapfrog, my previous most read blog, and continues to be my most read blog post, which led to following up with a resource list based on the questions and the interactions that followed my posting of that blog. And it was just a very personal response to what was happening. I, both from my scholarship and lived experience, believe deeply in the power of our story and lived experience. I believe that as people that are socially classified and placed in racial, it's very important that we are able to choose when to step into our personal narratives and to use that narrative. And I guess the thing that's going through my head, you can see me hesitating, is there's a lot of currency that has been put on, you know, we want to hear your stories, we want to use your stories. We don't always have to share our stories when the intent behind being asked to share doesn't go to the heart of what you're saying. But when it is, when I have those opportunities to speak in front of that board that's setting public policy, to be in front of that not even 2%, 1% higher ed Ivy League audience that is defining social policy that then underpins public policy, I will absolutely go there and I will make transparent. There's a theorist that said there is public relevance in issues personally felt. And so really going to those issues personally felt and linking them to the public issues is something that I practice. And so that's what I would say about that.
Thank you very, very much. Kim, do you want to jump in?
Yes, for sure. And thank you so much for this question, because it really gets to the heart of a lot of what my experience has been in public policy. And it gets to the notion of personal connection to our work also, which I find is often sort of removed from the policy space in some ways, and especially when you're learning about public policy. You know, like as a student, for example, when I was a grad student, there wasn't that focus on, you know, connecting to the work, right? And thinking about the interpersonal aspects of public policy and policy analysis. And yes, focus on the social context was there, but your own personal within the social, I found was missing. But it was really interesting because this is what I thought about basically every day, as a student and as a policy professional still today, and in working in different environments. It's sort of like the first issue that often comes to mind because as a policy analyst, I know there are certain things that are, expected of me, and there's certain traditions in Canada around policy analysis, but my experience has been different. I experience these systems in a different way. I'm sort of categorized in all different types of ways, and I see it play out truly in my, as I go through the world, here in Toronto and in other communities. So that personal conflict is really always there for me. But I've learned that it's an important growth, an important issue of growth and learning, because through those conflict areas, we actually can develop solutions and innovations, and we can understand how other people may be interacting with issues as well. And especially during the Black Lives Matter protests, I started to think about for people who aren't racialized in the same way, like how they may be experiencing these issues and the kinds of discomfort that comes up when we're talking about institutional racism. So I think there are many things I could say about this, but I feel like there is a level of personal, check-ins and healing that is important in doing anti-racism work, because we're all, well, I'll say in general, people are programmed, socially, right? Like we are taught how to conduct ourselves, how to behave, how to act in society. And a lot of it doesn't point us to thinking about things like colonialism and racism, on a daily basis. But I think we do have to address these issues, and especially in terms of how we interact with the issues. So really looking at what kinds of thoughts, attitudes, beliefs we have about people of, different backgrounds, thinking about how we can connect with others, in a heart-centered way and understand their experiences. Because I find that creates the environment for us to have these more authentic conversations. And, when we're in those places of policy engagement, especially when a policy professional is, looking to others outside of the policy world to provide input, if we're not authentic in our approach, it's felt, like communities feel that. And so that, I think, can add to issues of trust, mistrust, skepticism, feeling like things won't change, and that cynicism. So I really feel like that personal healing is really important, because not only does it help us to bring more of ourselves into the work and find solutions, in more efficient ways, and really open up to different approaches, which I think elevates policy in a lot of ways, but it helps us to, connect with others in a way that they're able to see that we're honoring each other's experiences, honoring each other's, place in terms of how we've come together and what our viewpoints may be. So I think it just creates that safe, safe environment that we often speak of, but it really starts inside, it starts from a place of love and understanding and ongoing healing. So I think that's what I'll share for now.
I'd like to share just a brief follow-up, because this has been really present for me. And I noticed as I was listening to Kim, I was also still ricocheting a little bit from your comment about this moment. And really what I want to add is just a moment of advocacy and call to action for all of us with socially marginalized identities that find ourselves with some power and privilege by virtue of our roles. in public policy, because I think inherently thinking about the question being how do you engage those personal tensions when you're in certain roles and you're doing this work and you're here for the public, for everybody, and all of that. I specifically want to add this. I don't even think that concern that this moment will pass is theoretical. I think we're already there. I think in most public spaces, again, speaking specifically from an anti-Black racist lens, we're still talking about George Floyd. Some people might remember and mention Breonna Taylor in the States. In Canada, we're not talking about the Canadian cases of Black and Indigenous folks. Even in the space since 2020, and again in that blog post, I mentioned some of them that died as a result of police encounters. But this is what I specifically want to point out about this and how I engage these in my work. Thank you for mentioning Reggie's, Tiana, I see that, and there's more. Even in the broader context of what is visible, on April 4, 2022, this year, Patrick Leolia, immigrant from DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, was fatally shot in the back of his head in Michigan. Barely made the news in the States or here. So in spaces that I've been in where specifically we're talking anti-racism, I have been asking if people know about Patrick, and people do not. And again, it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. And I'm not here to judge the case, and that's not my role. But the reality is, here's another Black man that was fatally shot in the back of the head. And how I've specifically been speaking about it is, and now we're back to regular programming. Where it was reported, there was brief mentions of, a couple of hundred people came out to protest this. The thousands are gone. And this is barely making the news. Because people are already moving on. In Canada, and in very important circles, I've been in meetings where people have said, again, and since 2020, anti-Black racism isn't really a Canadian thing. And I have spoken up and challenged that, both from personal experience and from the public instances, again, that are not spoken about. I have been in a very important circle where someone has said, well, in Canada, really, our focus in anti-racism is on truth and reconciliation and on our Indigenous reconciliation. And I am thankful for my Indigenous colleagues and friends that I have been in conversation with about this, and that who I was able to draw on to say, here, inherently, the risk we run with that mindset is continuing the colonial mentality of divide and conquer. That is not the issue. The issue is that we need to create an anti-racist society for all, centering truth and reconciliation, and doing all that we need to do from a policy and practice perspective, also for anti-Black racism, also for addressing the anti-Asian racism that has increased in this country and is also not talked about, also for an anti-racist society for all people of color. So I won't stop saying that in those circles, and I won't stop raising the flag when I hear things like, in Canada, anti-Black racism is not an issue. At that point, I am both Black and a public servant and someone that cares deeply about justice for everyone.
I just a bit of a thought on top of what you both said, and particularly that last point. If we say, like we like to say, that we're stronger when we're together, then the reverse must also be true, which is we're weaker when we're not. And if we're weaker when we're not, then that is quantifiable. And if we're weaker by our choice, then that is a public policy problem to be solved immediately. And I think that to me, is a different way of saying something similar to what you're saying that I use in my world, which is, it's not okay to be weaker because we're weaker over there as opposed to weaker somewhere else. Weaker and not as good and not as strong is never what Canada should be. Canada should always be better, should always be stronger. And where those issues are identifiable and where they're fixable, it's our duty to make sure they don't get left behind. And that's sort of a perspective that I would bring to some of the pieces that you both raised there. I want to switch to a question from the audience, and hopefully there'll be a couple more here, and maybe Sharda or Farah has another one, but I see one from, oh, it just moved up in my piece here, from Sherry Alexander Haynes. I'm interested in learning more about the idea of co-creation with communities. Can Dr. Gilpin-Jackson expand on this? And you may have some views too, Kim, if you want to add, but we'll start with you both.
Thank you. Oh, I could talk forever, so I'll try to keep this one simple. You know, more recently in international development circles, especially, I've seen a growing movement towards this, but what I've been sharing is that from an organization development and applied social services lens, we have known for a long, long time that elevating transformation requires that you work with and co-create with community. So in my practice, I tend to privilege those methodologies that allow that are built around this principle. So I've heard popularized in policy space and international development space, and in my own sort of human and organization development space recently, the notion of nothing about us without us. That is a core principle from a set of practices called positive deviance and liberating structures. And I know there's a team in the background helping us, but if you go to the Liberating Structures website, just Google it, you'll find it, and you can post a link for folks. These are methodologies that are based on micro and macro practices for engaging the collective, engaging with community. And that's one example of a set of methodology that bridges theory and practice, that moves from framework to practice, that is embedded in having co-creation methodologies that allow you to get the wisdom of the crowd before you move into any framing of policy. For any of you here that use appreciative inquiry, that's very much a co-creative methodology where you go out into community or in organizations and say, hey, we want to elevate the positive core of what's already working. And increasingly recently at something called the Appreciative Inquiry Jam, I talked about, because I've been writing for some time about using appreciative inquiry in a trauma-informed way. So going into communities, whether it's Black community or Indigenous communities, other racialized communities or trans communities, where there is inherent present and generational trauma, where you can't just go and say, hey, tell me about the positive core that's working. And these communities are relentless about self-care and healing and joyful and practices and things that allow them to be grounded to do the work. But at the same time, you know, it's a bit of a slap in the face to say, okay, we know the majority of policy is not working, but just come and tell us about what you see as positive about what we're doing. You really have to start with acknowledging so that there's space, because acknowledgement for what's not working is also a doorway to healing. It's also a doorway to allowing communities to trust that you're willing to have the real conversations. So from I've now written about a trauma-informed appreciative inquiry lens, where you show up to community and say, hey, I know things are not working and I know it's been hard. Let's talk about that context. And then let's move from that context to say, so what deeply resonates for you as a community? What matters? Where do we need to go? And then let's go into those questions that inquire into into a positive future that you co-create with the community. So I think the short answer is look for methodologies that inherently center that co-creation and relentlessly use them in that facilitating the journey, because that's the bridge from theory to practice. This whole practice of going into a small room, creating policy, and then going out and asking for feedback, that is not community engagement. That is not co-creation. And actually that is creating more distrust than creating trust, right? It's starting with a blank sheet. It is reaching out to community before you start drafting the thing and throughout the journey. And when you need to make some decisions that may be hard for the community because they may not be the entirety of what they wanted, is you're there early and you're saying that. Because again, we know from research that people will actually appreciate and respect policy and process that they've been fully engaged in. In fact, the acronym we use in our field is people will support what they've been part of creating. And from a fair process perspective, which is a theoretical term that's well researched, if people have been part of the process that they think is fair and transparent and one that they can trust, they will stand behind the outcomes, even if it's not 100% they think they want. Because often, from a public policy perspective, we can't do 100% the thing that everybody wants, but fair process matters.
All right. Kim, just in the interest of time and getting on to another excellent questions there, I wonder if I could ask you this other question instead, and that way we'll get one more topic on. And I know you would have had wonderful things to say there. You talked about the personal in the public policy work in the last answer that you gave, which of course we were all trained that like the sacrosanct duty of public policy is to depersonalize everything and to, just be objective, right? And this is the tyranny of screen names. I don't know if it's Deepik or Deepika, but Deepika Grover being the screen name, points out that very often the status quo is presented by that's objective, and any changes away from that is a fop to an interest group or whatever else, because we'd already figured out the objective, and otherwise the institution wouldn't be the way it was. The question is, how might one help leaders keep in their line of sight their use of institutional whiteness as a default? And so in your work running into this, what would you recommend to people?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and concept of institutional whiteness. And I've actually been looking into this in terms of the Canadian context, and my realization and understanding that a lot of our policy institutions were colonial institutions, right? And are still in a lot of ways. Our system of parliament was taken from the UK, the Westminster, system. And so that is a system of institutional whiteness in a lot of ways, right? Because it does center a specific type of approach that is from Europe, and it really hasn't, I think, evolved to reflect a more pluralistic approach to governance, where different schools of thought and ways of doing public policy are recognized and discussed and incorporated into the way that we do policy work. I'll say that this may not be accessible for everyone, but one way that I was able to identify institutional whiteness was through my work with Indigenous communities when I worked with the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, and was really very privileged to be able to see public policy done from a totally different way, where it was infused with culture, it is infused with spirituality. It is taken directly, priorities are taken directly from community members. And so it really flipped things in my mind, because as you mentioned, we're sort of trained to depersonalize, right, and be objective. But things that are objective and things that are the status quo are socially constructed. And so I think there is a certain level of personal education that has to go into this. Like if you haven't been exposed to it, it's really challenging to see it, because if we grow up in a society where, where we only see really one way of doing things, or consistently presented with, a particular way of doing things that's rooted in a specific culture or region of the world, and that's what we always see unless we specifically taken steps to learn about other approaches. So yeah, I think there is a personal education piece in that. And really, the thing, when I was learning with Indigenous communities and working as a policy analyst there, it really just changed my entire viewpoint on public policy, and helped me to also connect with my own personal background as a person with African and Indian descent. So that experience sort of awakened me and showed me that it was okay to look to other traditions and ways of doing things. And that took me to a space where I was then doing research on, ancient African civilizations, so pre-colonial, civilizations, and looking into ancient Indian approaches, to just living and being, and different schools of thought. And so I think there is, because we aren't taught in this way of looking to multiple viewpoints and ways of doing things through our education systems here, for the most part in Canada, I think it is sort of a point of personal responsibility to do some of this work on our own. And it is healing work in a way, right? Because I mean, it sort of puts us in a position of replicating institutional racism to an extent, right? If we're adopting this way of thinking where, there's in the hierarchy that is racism, the system of racism that we have in North America today. If we're always privileging one group over others, in our ways of thought and our approaches to all manner of things, and that is replicating institutional racism. And I had to reconcile with that understanding myself, and that was another point of personal conflict. Just going back to a previous question. So there's like multiple layers of unlearning and relearning, and also allowing yourself to look to your own background to see, all the rich traditions and, ways of thought and ways of living that can inform what we're doing today. Like, it's still relevant today. It's not just history. It's not just stuff from, our home countries or home cultures. Like, it's still relevant and useful today. So that's a part, I think, of identifying that institutional, that singular institutional approach that we are confronted with.
Well, thank you very much. We started with Yabon Gilton Jackson, who gave the first answer, and we've ended up with Kim giving the last answer, but throughout it has been absolutely fascinating. This has been one of my favorite conversations of the year so far. And even if you talk to me on December 31st, it's still going to be way up there. I want to thank you both for such openness, such creativity, such dedication, such passion, and such thoughtfulness. And so thank you very much for this event. And with that, I will turn it back over to the organizers, who will have the sad duty of closing us out.
Indeed, it is a sad duty, because this conversation has been amazing. I have learned so much. I've been trying to live tweet and take notes. I had a meeting earlier this week, and I wish I was able to quote what code development and code design really means, because what they did wasn't what Dr. Jackson told us they should be doing. So on behalf of IPAC-NCR, Kim, Yabom, DM Kwan Watson, thank you so much for participating. To the participants in the audience, thank you for taking part in today's event. Our hope, as we said, was that you will leave this event with a better understanding of anti-racism policy frameworks, also better understanding of your responsibilities and how we move from theory to practice. I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't done so already, to follow IPAC-NCR on Twitter. It's IPAC_NCR. Also, to sign up to become a member of IPAC. is go to IPAC.ca and look under the chapters where the National Capital Region chapter. As an IPAC member, you are going to be joining the public sector peers and leaders who are amongst the first to learn about cutting edge public administration theory and practice, like today's conversation, right? Also a reminder that on September 13th, if all goes well and we're still out there socializing, we want you to join us at Mill Street Group Hub for a members only event. So again, please visit IPAC.ca to register for that. Also, stay tuned, look out in your email for our other events. As Ursula mentioned, there's an event happening in May and then the one in September. Again, for those of you who were like me, busy listening and didn't capture all the notes, there will be a YouTube recording. So please stay tuned for that on our IPAC page. I also encourage you to follow our speakers on social media because they write great blogs, they do amazing work. As public servants, we have a commitment to learn, to continuously learn, but also to unlearn. So as we said today, if we are making policy choices that cause division and bring us apart, then we have a responsibility to question that and find ways to craft better public policy so that we do come together. And I firmly believe that the discussion we had today on anti-racism policy frameworks and other approaches to more equitable outcomes is what we need to do. So again, on behalf of the organizers, on behalf of IPAC-NCR and the speakers, thank you all so much for participating. Have a wonderful afternoon. Now join me, go forward, and let's make better public policy. Let's elevate public policy, because racism doesn't only harm Black Canadians, Indigenous people, and racialized people, it harms all of Canada. And the best of us is denied if we don't harness our full potential. So please do your part. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.